Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm a professional artist and a fountain pen enthusiast. And in this video, we're going to talk about brown inks. I'm going to explain why you should be using them if you aren't already, and give you my recommendations for 6 brown inks that deserve a place in your collection. And then, as a bonus, I'm going to show you 6 different ways these inks can be used to create art. Let's get started. Before I begin, I'd like to, very briefly, tell you that I have a slew of affordable, fast-paced, and information-packed online workshops scheduled for early next year. The plan is to reprise my Fundamentals of Crosshatching, How to Draw the Head in Pen and Ink, and my Drawing Textures and Details workshops. Please visit my website, the link to which I'll leave below if you're interested. And if you can't attend those dates, I also have a number of downloadable classes available for purchase through Vimeo. Thank you for your patience, and back to the video. Brown inks have been widely used by artists and calligraphers for centuries. Part of their appeal is purely practical, since they can be made from a number of inexpensive, commonly found organic materials. The most commonly used inks are bistre, which uses soot collected from the burning of wood, walnut ink, made by boiling the shells of black walnuts, and sepia ink, sourced from cuttlefish. But a more important reason for their popularity, and the reason why they continue to be relevant for the modern artist, is that brown inks bring a subtle warmth and color variation to your art. And subtlety is the key point here. Artists nowadays have a dizzying variety of colors to choose from, but when an ink color is too bright or saturated, it has a tendency to draw attention to itself, creating an unwelcome distraction. Brown ink is a way to gently add color to an artwork, and, to use a culinary analogy, imbue a gentle background flavor that doesn't overwhelm your drawing stew. Furthermore, unlike black ink, whose color range is by definition limited, the color of brown inks is considerable, leaning towards neutral gray to tilting towards orange, thereby allowing an artist a whole range of possibilities. Color is probably the most primal and powerful tool for communicating emotion and psychology that we visual artists have at our disposal. And though there are definitely cultural differences in the way we interpret color, generally warmer colors, colors that lean more towards orange, are associated with positive emotions, whereas colors that are cooler, which lean more towards blue, are associated with negative emotions. Subject matter and execution play a large part in this, of course, but consider the emotional resonance of these 2 paintings by William Turner. This one with a very warm color scheme, and this one with a very cool color scheme. The first one, to my mind, has a joyful quality, whereas the second painting feels mournful. Through careful color decisions, Turner set the emotional tone in each painting in the same way a musical composition can be set to either a minor or major key. By being conscious of your choice of browns, you can do the same. And while it's true that brown inks are closely associated with old masters, not every brown ink will give your drawing a stodgy, traditional look. Some of the inks I'm going to show you are quite complex in terms of color and do not behave in traditional ways, especially when used in washes, giving your drawing an edgy, modern twist. Let me show you the 6 inks I recommend. As mentioned, brown inks come in a huge variety, and my intention here, besides showing inks that I love and use frequently, is to give you a range of possibilities in terms of color and working properties. Let's start with this one, Terre de Feu, made by J. Herbin. This is an ink that I bought years ago, and it remains a perennial favorite. I'm trying something new when it comes to ink testing, which hopefully covers all the necessary criteria in a condensed, standardized, and engaging way. All tests are conducted with my usual Bristol paper made by Strathmore. This is a smooth, hard white paper that takes all kinds of inks well and is a good representative surface. The pen is a Franklin Christoph Model 31 in antique glass, being used as an eyedropper, which has been fitted with a Fountain Pen Revolution No. 6 Ultraflex nib with an ebonite feed. Not only is this a stunning pen that I love using, I think it'll be a good test of ink flow, since this is a flex pen that will effectively show off the shading properties of each ink. Let's start the test. The first part is an ink blob created by this standardized process. Undiluted ink is applied with a brush, then water is dripped into it with an eyedropper, then the blob is allowed to partially dry, and then blotted a little bit with a paper towel. Then I apply ink with a pen and turn it into some kind of weird deep-sea monster. I believe this method allows us to see the ink color under a variety of different applications, with the added benefit that it creates all kinds of cool doodles. The next test is a simple value scale with undiluted ink applied in 3 coats. This allows us to see the value range of the ink in different concentrations and is a good test for shading. Now that we have the 2 color swatches, let's see if we can describe this ink's properties. In terms of color range, in its lighter aspects, it creates a soft, dull pink, and as it darkens, starts turning towards a muddled alizarin crimson. In its darker aspects, it becomes a deep orange-brown color. And under the color is a gray undertone that can be visible when the ink is blotted away. In terms of shading, I rate this ink as very high. This ink is transparent, going from a mid-value to a very dark brown, almost approaching black when the ink is applied heavily. Because the range of reds, oranges, browns, and grays in this ink, I rate the color variation to be very, very high. In the test for flow, the ink is excellent, performing almost perfectly in this pen, which, due to its ink-hungry nib, requires very good flow to keep from railroading. The ebonite feed here helps, but this is still a very persnickety pen, and if the ink wasn't wet enough, it'll railroad immediately. For the last test, let's try water resistance. When washed over with water, it exhibits some water-resistant properties, though the brown leftover lines do exhibit some feathering, losing some of their sharpness. Let's see how this ink performs in a drawing. For these drawing tests, I will switch to a hot-press watercolor paper made by Stonehenge, since Bristol paper is not all that great at accepting washes. For this technique, I'm going to start by tinting the paper with a light wash. Inks composed of multiple colors tend to separate easily, since each color dye has different particle sizes and densities, resulting in uneven washes with a lot of color variation. Some of you might be wondering why this would be a desirable quality. Well, these things are a matter of taste, but consider that perfect evenness in color is not necessarily a good thing in painting, and that many watercolor painters choose to only partially mix their colors, or choose granulating color, which creates rough textures. Inks that have multiple coloring agents that pool and dry unevenly are just another way to introduce a lovely degree of chaos into your work. And with this ink, even in light washes, we see a lovely interplay of pink and light grays, creating a smoky, sensual color combination. The next step in this technique is to apply a darker wash to the shadows. In stronger concentrations, the wash takes on more of a saturated color with a range of muted oranges and grayish-purple variations of color. These are surprising colors coming from what is supposed to be a reddish-brown ink. But again, many brown inks get their muted colors from a combination of complementary bright pigments, in this case purple and orange. And in washes like this, they separate out and become more prominent. For details and darker shadows, I switch to my pen. I'm being minimal with my line work here, trying not to obscure the lovely color variation in the washes. In the pen, this ink goes quite dark, barely revealing its full chaotic potential. In fact, if you were to use this ink only for line work, you would think this is somewhat stuffy, vintage-looking reddish-brown ink. This is why I think those very strange creatures who only use their pens for writing miss out on a large part of the fun. Since I toned the paper at the beginning, I'm going to add whites with something that might surprise some of you: bleach. Most fountain pen inks are sensitive to bleach, but this ink is particularly well affected, going completely white. This allows you to easily create white marks in a way that can only be reproduced by either using liquid frisket or by carefully preserving the whites of the paper. This way of working I first encountered in my early 20s when trying to find work as a background painter in the animation industry. This method is most likely not archival, so I would seek out more durable methods for finished work, but for sketchbook drawing, this creates some pretty cool effects that you really can't get any other way. Here is the final drawing. This is a color that isn't traditional, though there are some drawings by Goya using a sanguine ink that are kind of similar. I think this ink strikes a nice balance, in that it definitely has a vintage antique vibe to it, but its unevenness of color also makes it unmistakably modern. One thing I should mention is that while there's no information on the coloring agents used in this ink, it's very likely not light-fast or archival. This means that this ink will undergo color changes over time or even fade depending on quite a few factors, including the quality of the drawing surface and the exposure to light, as well as atmospheric conditions. Well, it's up to every artist to make the determination of whether to use this ink. I think generally, if a drawing is intended to stay in a sketchbook protected from light, then this ink is okay to use. However, if you're doing a work for sale or one that's intended for long-term display, I would stay away from using this ink. Here's another unusual ink with a lot of color complexity and high shading properties, this time in the yellow-brown range of the spectrum. Monteverde Joy. Let's do an ink blob sea monster and see what we get. This ink is a surprising mix of colors, being yellow ochre and raw sienna in its lighter form, then making a sharp transition to an intensely orange burnt sienna in the midtones, and then becoming charred brown in its darkest aspects. It also has some gray undertones which offset the warm colors. This ink has some of the strongest shading properties of any ink in my collection, undiluted, going from very light to very dark, all in a single stroke. This is an extremely complex, multicolored potion that introduces a lovely chaotic quality to any artwork it's used in. In terms of flow, it's very good, one of my favorite for flex pens, since it allows this ink to fully show off its shading qualities. And in terms of water resistance, it has very little, easily dissolving into a fuzzy mess. Let's try drawing with this fascinating stuff. Inks with low water resistance can actually be very effective for wash drawing if you use a specific order. In this drawing, I'm going to start with a very light wash to separate the highlights from the lights. And then, once this layer is thoroughly dry, go in with a slightly darker wash. Then I start in with a pen. So far, this is standard operating procedure, but since this ink is highly water soluble, it gives me a kind of control I can't get with more water resistant ink. If I want to lighten the lines, all I have to do is wash over them with water and then blot off the wash with an absorbent paper towel. That stops the ink from dissolving and freezes it in its partially softened state. If I only want to lighten slightly, I'm going to apply the paper towel after a second or two. And if I want more softening, I will extend the time. Using this ink as wash is one of my favorite things to do, since it has a tendency to go absolutely everywhere, creating all kinds of lovely textures. This is an ink for artists that sometimes enjoy embracing the chaos. As you can probably tell, I'm an artist with a lot of traditional training, and while I don't regret any of it, I sometimes have a hard time working in the looser, more expressive styles I also enjoy. This is where tools come in. By working with non-traditional materials, pens with strangely shaped nibs, inks that refuse to cooperate, it forces me to give up control I spent so many years cultivating, and allows me to relax into a more expressionistic style. This color in particular is my go-to when I need something that is not over-the-top saturated, but is still strong and contrasty enough to create a dramatic, contemporary-looking work. Here is the final drawing using Monteverde Joy ink. Similar to the previous ink, Terre de Feu, this ink also has a slightly vintage feel, reminiscent of some of the yellow-tinted inks used by Domenico Tiepolo. Like Terre de Feu, it's also slightly more saturated and unruly, an ink that has a solid foundation in tradition, but also one that is boundary-pushing, joyfully looking forward to new kinds of art making, rather than being permanently stuck in the past. If you're looking for something more traditional, with less crazy color variation, this sepia ink made by Callifolio is a very good option. This is a very traditional-looking brown, approximating many of the Biester inks used by the masters. Let's run it through my series of tests. The ink blob shows this ink to be highly transparent and highly uniform in color. It does perhaps tilt a touch pink in its lighter aspects and has a subtle gray undertone. So the color range is generally brown, which leans a little bit more towards gray than towards orange. Its transparency gives it a fair amount of shading properties, but nothing tremendous. Shading introduces a touch of chaos into the drawing process, since shading inks tend to dry more irregularly. That said, evenness is also dependent on the type of paper being used and whether your drawing surface has been tilted. This ink rates low in color variation. This is an ink that you reach for when you want traditional looking brown and absolutely nothing else. And now for the practical tests. The flow is absolutely excellent, making it a perfect choice for flex. And in the water resistance test, this ink leaves just a touch of line when washed over, so this is an ink with some water resistance to it. This ink will work great with the technique I just used with Monteverde Joy. However, for my drawing test, we're going to try something else. I'm going to demonstrate another way of adding white to your drawings. After I penciled in my drawing with graphite, I added white strokes using a wax-based color pencil made by Faber-Castell in their Polychromos series. Since I'm starting with a white paper, it's a little bit hard to see, but as you'll see later, that won't be too much of a problem. Once I've put in my white, it's time to tint the paper with a thin wash. As previously mentioned, washes made with transparent dark inks tend to dry down in a more chaotic way. But here, because of the color consistency, the wash was quite smooth and even. Note that the wash covered up all of the work I did with white. I'll show you how to remedy this at the end of the drawing. For now, I'm going to add shadows with a darker wash. This ink works perfectly well with wash, creating delicate, even transitions. Because the ink doesn't go super dark like some brown inks, the drawing you do with it will be a touch on the lighter side, giving your work a gentle softness. This can be seen in the line work, which even when done with a juicy flex pen like this, isn't too strong. In the subsequent applications, we start to see some unevenness after drying, but keep in mind that I'm working on a flat surface, which allows the washes to move in every direction. Had this been done on a slightly tilted surface, the washes would have run downhill and dried more evenly. Now that the washes are dry, let's bring out the white marking I put down at the beginning by going over them with a kneaded eraser. Since the pencil is wax-based, it resists the ink from being absorbed into the paper in those areas, allowing you to simply rub it away, revealing the white underneath. The effect is very gentle, but quite effective when you want a soft look to your piece. And this way of working is certainly more archival than the bleaching method, and is perfectly suitable for more finished work meant for display. This ink is the one I reach for when I want a traditional looking brown that's very even in color and easy to control. The color has a muted, calming warmth, reminding me of old wooden cabinets and tanned leather. Despite the warmth, it also has a certain seriousness and solemnity to it, derived from its association with old master drawing techniques. For those looking for a smoky, brownish gray with high shading and color complexity, I recommend Rohrer and Klingner Sepia. The ink blob Deep Sea Monster shows this to be a highly complex ink, with gray-brown being the dominant color, with warm pink and purple undertones. In its darkest aspect, it manages to go pure black. In terms of shading, since the general value of the ink is on the darker side, the shading is not prominent, but if diluted a touch, can be made stronger. As for color variation, while the interplay of various colors is not visible if the ink is used only in a pen, in washes the color variation becomes evident. In terms of flow, this ink performs perfectly and is one of my go-to for ink-hungry flex pens. And in the water resistance test, it does have some water resistance to it, but the lines feather slightly, so this would not be the best choice to go over with washes. Let's do a drawing with this ink and see how it performs. In this drawing, I'm going to start with light wash and reserve the whites, as I would in a watercolor painting. In light thin washes, this ink doesn't separate, creating a lovely gray color with a touch of warmth. And so long as the washes are applied thinly, the color does stay consistent. It's only when washes are applied heavily, giving the dyes time to separate, does the color complexity become evident, with pink and gray undertones becoming visible, and the swirling darker dyes creating all kinds of wonderfully chaotic textures. And I would say, of all the inks I'm showing you, this one creates the wildest washes, which contrast well with this ink's staid, conservative appearance in line work. Like Terre de Feu, it's also sensitive to bleach, but with a surprising property, in that it leaves behind a yellow ochre tint that can't be seen in any other way. The bleaching creates an irregular surface that might be difficult to control, but I think it can be used in places and adds an extra layer of color complexity which would be very interesting to exploit. The smoky, mysterious color of the ink recalls early 20th century photography, but when used with heavy washes, it reveals its funky color complexity and becomes magical and even playful, especially when you use bleach to add the odd yellow color. Like Terre de Feu and Monteverde Joy, this is an ink for traditionalists who want to break out of the traditional mold, but only just a little. Now let's talk about an old favorite which I discovered at the very beginning of my fountain pen journey, which has been a constant traveling companion ever since, Noodler's Brown. This is a strange ink with some wonderful properties. The Deep Sea Monster ink blob reveals a large number of different coloring agents, with the dominant color being yellow-leaning brown, with deep oranges and gray undertones, going almost black in its darkest aspects. In terms of shading, this ink is transparent but also dark, so the shading is somewhat limited. Of all the inks in my collection, this one probably has the largest color variation, with the grays and vivid dark oranges creating wonderfully complex textures. In the flow test, this ink performs almost perfectly and has been one of my go-tos for use in flex pens. In the water resistance test, the ink reveals one of its other useful and intriguing qualities, its partial water resistance. This ink contains coloring agents that are fully waterproof, and other coloring agents which are water-soluble. This means that when you go over your inked lines with water, the water-soluble agents dissolve into a wash, leaving behind sharp, waterproof lines. This is a property that can be exploited to create pen and wash drawings. In this drawing, I'm going to do just that. I start with an initial line drawing, put in a few details, and hatch a little in the shadow areas. This technique takes some practice to get right, since you have to anticipate where you're going to place the washes, and the fact that the lines will become softer as they're gone over with water. Once the lines are inked, I wait a few minutes for them to dry and go over them with water. The water-soluble portion dissolves and creates a lovely yellowish-brown wash, which I can then manipulate to model the subtle halftones of the face. And then, once the washes are dry, they actually become more or less waterproof and can be added to with another wash or gone over with extra line work. This is a wonderfully compact technique that requires nothing but a pen and a water brush. And the washes in their ink are also wonderfully chaotic, with bright flashes of rusty orange and ashy gray. This is probably the most complex and poorly behaved ink in my collection, though if you use it only for line work, it'll not reveal itself as anything other than a well-performing tobacco brown. Only in washes does this ink reveal its intense, chaotic nature with wild, unruly color variations. Though we're still dealing with brown ink, and there's definitely a begrudging nod to tradition here, the rusty oranges have an acidic quality and an aggressive saturation which is unmistakably contemporary. The last thing I'd like to note is that Noodler describes this ink as partially bulletproof, which means that some of the coloring agents in it are indelible, and possibly even archival, and some are not. Whether this is true or not, we have no way of knowing, since such formulations have not been tested by time, so I would probably avoid using this ink in work intended for sale or long display. Let's talk about another longtime favorite, the Atramentis Document Brown. This is an ink that I've reviewed, but it deserves a revisit since out of the 6, it's the only one that's pigmented, fully waterproof, and archival. In the ink blob, it shows itself to be highly transparent with gentle shading qualities. The color is traditional, a little warmer and more saturated than the Callifolio Sepia, and equally uniform both in dilutions and in strong concentrations. It does have a slight gray undertone, which can only be seen when the ink is blotted out. This ink does exhibit slight shading, drying with a subtle unevenness in washes. This is definitely an ink for those that need more control over their washes and don't need an ink that creates all kinds of crazy color variation or texture when it's dry. In terms of ink flow, this ink is perfect for the high flow requirements of flex writing and drawing. And in the water-resistant tests, I rushed a little, and the ink left a touch of residue when washed over, but had it been given a few more minutes to dry, it would have left very little residue, if any. Water resistance is also highly dependent on the paper being used, with more absorbent papers being more effective. Let's try drawing with it to see its properties to the fullest. I'm going to use a mostly traditional method here, starting with line work and then applying washes over it. The advantage of putting hatching first is that when putting down lines over a wash, the lines might have a tendency to spread and widen, and of course, if the ink is not entirely waterproof like this one, even re-wet the washes underneath. The reason I said this was a mostly traditional method is because I'm still going to do something unorthodox by covering the entire paper with a light wash, and then for highlights I'm going to use an eraser. Yes, an eraser, you heard that correctly. This is something that works surprisingly well even on certain shellac-based drawing inks and can be used as a subtle value lightener. This method will only lighten the paper slightly, so the effect is subtle, but allows for quite a bit of control since you can erase gradually, resulting in a very soft look. The Atramentis document brown's archival and waterproof properties make it an essential part of an artist's toolkit. I often use it for landscape drawing and pen and watercolor, where the brown creates a softer, less graphic feeling than black ink, lending a vibrant, warm color complement to the cooler colors often found in nature. This is a very traditional, uniform color for artists who enjoy creating traditional-looking work without the monkey business that I find so fascinating in other inks in this video. I hope you enjoyed this review of 6 brown inks and the 6 accompanying techniques used with them. And if you have a favorite brown ink or a particularly neat way to use it, please let me know, since one can never have enough inks or techniques. Thanks so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye bye.